My name is Jason Lange. I'm the founder and president for BloomBoard. We've been in the teacher development, teacher recruitment space for many, many years now. We're about 14 years old as a company standpoint goes. In all of the time that we've been in working with districts, we have come across just a whole bunch of things that districts are doing to try and recruit, attract, retain really great teachers. And so we thought it'd be helpful just to try and digest a bunch of that, talk a little bit about the implications across that, and really, get you in, get you out, and try and be as respectful as your time as possible. Just from a logistics standpoint, I'll leave so we'll have a bunch of opportunities for some Q&A, and frankly, for you all to share out things that might be working for you as well. But I've also got the chat and I've got the Q&A and the up here, so we can help monitor the process. So without further ado, let's get moving. So again, really the goal here is to try and make this as action-oriented as possible. And so there is going to be a ton coming that we're just going to try and touch on pretty quickly and try and hit on. For any of these things, right, if there's notes, we can obviously follow up later and talk more. I can probably put you in connection with some of the districts that have done some of these things the best in the process. And so just want to really, again, try to make this as action-oriented as possible, not specific to necessarily the BloomBoard world, but just things that we've seen, given how painful the crisis and the shortage is right now, things that we've seen that have really worked. Generally, I tend to bucket these things across three different areas. So there's this whole new, in the last year or two, right, last few years, this whole idea around how do you actually grow your own talent from within your community. And that has high school, right? Grow your own means a lot of different things, a lot of different contexts, but I lump this in with how do you build, right, teachers from within the community. That might be high school students, it might be near term, paras, but really what does it look like to build from within? Recruiting new talent. And so these are folks who are not in the community, but are really you're trying to attract to the community, to the district. What's that look like? And then ultimately, right, how are you trying to retain existing talent in the process? And so we're going to tick through these, and really the idea is, right, we'll end up with a whole bunch of the quick hits, wins, different things. And so feel free to take notes, feel free to ask questions, and we'll jump in. So first, right, and again, these are going to be, I'm trying to go through these pretty quick and just talk through what works. And then I'll try and assimilate this from how does this compare to the corporate world, and what are some of the other implications? In the grow your own world, we know there are a bunch of folks working on high school dual credit pathways right now. Indiana, I just talked to some senators from Maryland. They're doing a lot of work around trying to embed high school dual credit and future educator coursework into schools and create pathways. And so if you haven't done or haven't looked at that yet, there's probably likely some policy conversations in the state already happening to be able to get high school students dual credit and at least get them access to some student teaching in elementary schools in the process. On top of that, right, we've seen in Miami-Dade has done a pretty interesting job of this, which is really starting to create, even all the way down to early high school, actually offer, right, the pathways for employment upon graduation. And I know some states have, right, age requirements in the process, but what we find is there's actually quite a few schools that never really talk to their high school graduates, right, or their upcoming graduates. And so as you're starting to talk to high school graduates now, the idea, especially given some of these new advancement, these new degree pathways that we'll touch on, the idea that you can start to employ high school grads as paras and get them into the career path and get them into bachelor's degree programs with no debt is a really compelling option for lots of kids. And so we're starting to see that as a new lever where districts are really starting to think about how do I market, right, my own schools, right, my elementary schools to my high school kids after they graduate as an alternative to college and as an alternative to, going into debt, but actually earning their degrees, earning their college degrees while employed in that process. And so we've seen a lot of interesting opportunities there. There's been a bunch of work done, especially from, more Black male educators, right, more marginalized populations around trying to create some affinity groups. So the Center for Black Educator Development and the Equity Institute have done some really interesting work around creating spaces for affinity groups to help create, right, better communities within educator populations to help attract new talent into the system. And so again, really trying to think about what affinity groups, what ways can you position the work in, right, sort of helping candidates understand, right, that they're not alone in this sort of entry into the profession. And there are a lot of other folks who potentially have the similar interests, and give them space to be able to have those conversations in the process. And so there's a lot of really new, interesting work happening in that space as well. Obviously, the teacher apprenticeship world, we've got definitely some friendly names, friendly faces in some of the group here. Teacher apprenticeship is one of these brand new, or relatively new within the last 2 years, new sort of areas that are really about how do you sort of take candidates from within your community, and how do you actually build on the job degree pathways for them while people are fully employed. And so especially for your existing paras, right, if you haven't actually gone through the process of asking and surveying your paras to see how many of them would like to be fully certified teachers and what level of credit do they have currently, that's a really amazing, very simple, yet sort of very concrete first step to be able to actually see what's coming up and how could you actually start to solve the teacher shortage from within the community. And so that's really one way to start to think about it. And then there's a whole bunch of new legislation that's actually starting to bring net new funding to school districts to help pay for these degrees. So the idea that all of a sudden we can now start to create a pathway where, dozens, thousands of candidates can actually start to not only earn their bachelor's degree in special ed or their bachelor's degree in elementary ed, but they can do it at no out-of-pocket cost. And they can do it while employed full time and working for the school in a para role, in a sub role, depending on the context, depending on their own sort of circumstance. And so this is definitely one of the ones that we would sort of look at and say, there is a ton happening here. And if you haven't started to dig into that in your state, it's definitely worth even just sort of a cursory review of where is the state, and happy to sort of help share what that looks like today. In a similar vein, right, we know sort of the apprenticeship programs vary quite a bit because there's pre-apprenticeship and high school apprenticeship pathways. Really this idea that there's now, whether they're apprenticeship or not, just para to bachelor's degree programs. We're seeing that happen in large, right, sort of swaths of the country, and really trying to help build that sort of future bachelor's degree structure inside of the para role. And whether that can be done, right, as an instructional aid, or whether that can be done as a one-period release time. We even have some new higher ed partners that we've been working on that are actually launching in 3 years, 0 to 120 bachelor's degree programs that can be done in an accelerated pace inside of 3 years. And the idea is you actually give those candidates credit for those 3 years of work experience towards the degree. And so everyone's then able to earn a 3-year bachelor's degree while working full time without nights and weekends courses. And what we know from the para surveys that we've done, we've surveyed thousands of paras at this point. We know from the para surveys we've done, 50 to 60% of paras would actually like to be fully certified. And so in many districts, that would actually solve the teacher shortage outright right there. The problem is most paras will say, right, it's either too costly or I just don't have time because of my schedule, because of my family, because of my second job. And so now higher ed and sort of the apprenticeship models are really starting to think about what does it mean to embed those degrees into the actual, right, sort of job environment? And how do you sort of confer all the credits, right, 3 credit courses in portfolio form and make that a really sort of tangible opportunity to give someone a degree, even though they may feel entirely locked out of that work. And so far, we've just seen both an explosion of interest in numbers. I think in DeKalb, we launched an initial pilot, and we had, in just the sort of the para to bachelor's realm, something like 200 candidates sign up in the first 48 hours. And so it just gives you a sense of, we've now starting to see some pretty amazing wait lists that districts are actually creating just to try and deal with the demand of how do we get paras into fully licensed positions, and how do we help support that process on its own. There's been a bunch of work with Future Educators of America that have done some pretty good job. I know they've got some state chapters that they're doing some different things in Florida and some other places. And so that's another pretty interesting option to take a look at if you haven't already sort of seen that. And then again, I want to be able to sort of make sure that we sort of open this up. If there's anybody who has, other options to talk about, we'll talk a little bit here. It's like, what does this really mean in terms of, right, sort of the implications of these pathways? But are there any other sort of grow your own sort of opportunities that folks have seen that have worked really well in your districts, just in terms of sharing, or other questions that folks might have related to these? Okay. Well, feel free to put them into the chat. I know that's not the fastest process, so we can certainly come back. When it comes to growing your own talent, right, one of the things that we want to sort of, we've seen time and time again start to come up is this difference in just the fundamental reality of growing your own is actually a different generation and a generational perspective than likely anyone on the call. And so if you think about the folks in our recruiting departments, often, right, the millennials, right, often sort of folks in the Gen X world, right, we're now trying to recruit a workforce that just fundamentally thinks differently. And so as you're thinking about growing your own pipeline, as you're thinking about building systems to recruit candidates from Gen Z, right, it's really important to start to take a pretty hard look at what does that actually mean? And what are the implications for how that sort of process plays out? So just as a context, right, demographically, we're already seeing a pretty crazy shift. So, a couple of years ago, if you think about sort of the makeup of the workforce was mostly millennials, right? And a bunch of Gen Xers that were sort of in retirement process. This Gen X population is already, right? We know that they sort of hung on and didn't retire in the normal curves given COVID. But as we now get into the next couple of years, right, that generation, that population is going to retire, and we are going to be almost entirely based on, right, millennials and Gen Z. And so as you then think about what does it mean to recruit, right, really understanding the persona and understanding the Gen Z perspective is really, really important because it matters because it's a fundamentally different type of perspective than we've seen before. And a lot of what we mean by that is, right, in the Gen Z world, we're talking about the first sort of global generation, right, where TikTok and, right, sort of all of the sort of social media is basic level work. Right? Basic level tools that they've been dependent on from a very early age. And so what the implications there are is, right, it's also a very hustler-centric generation. And, right, 75% of Gen Z, right, would like a hobby of some sort to be, right, their full-time job. And that the implication there is, right, how do you now convey to Gen Z, right, here's a space where you can now have time and space over the summers, right, to actually engage in that hobby, in those things. And that's a really interesting sort of model to start to think about the implications of what our recruiting, what our messaging looks like, right? Obviously, right, from a tech native standpoint, right, Gen Z lives in this world where tech has been the baseline for their entire lives. And so even something as simple as, are you able to apply for a job through an actual, right, iPhone? And can you text an application to a job? If you can't, and you have to go to a website, you've already started to sort of, put some barriers up for Gen Z in terms of how they actually want to engage, because text-centric, right, mobile-centric design is everything. And that vast majority of Gen Z, right, isn't really trying to get to a laptop anytime soon because they've been programmed that everything can be done on their phones. And therefore, we have to think about the way that we recruit them in order to sort of think about how do we meet them where they are. And so really understanding what does it mean to sort of have very tech-enabled systems. And again, a lot of this comes from what Amazon and Target can do, right? Amazon can basically employ you, get you signed up on text, on your phone, and then start to pay you on your phone almost immediately. And those are the alternatives that teachers, right, that sort of paras are also looking for in the market today. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that, right, Gen Z actually sort of likes and prefers just to actually chat on text, and that there's a lot that can be done to sort of make that process, right, much easier. And that ultimately then, right, people, right, the Gen Z world also knows, right, that they want a much more sort of collaborative environment. And, right, that's not probably too different than what we've seen elsewhere. But really the idea is, right, what does it look like to be able to sort of actually enable people to understand who else am I working with? And again, the more we can sort of highlight stories, I think one of my favorite, sort of stories from one of our sort of district recruiters was, if you're right now still sending district admin to spaces for teacher recruitment fairs and the like, right, that's actually a big shortcoming because it turns out, right, especially Gen Z, they don't want to hear from admin. They want to hear from other teachers. And so the best, right, sort of one of the best recruiting tactics from a job fair standpoint is just to send other really engaged teachers that can talk about, hey, here's what I'm doing in my building. Here's why I love my job. Here's why I love the work that I'm doing. And here's why I love my principal. And that's a much better recruitment tool than, right, just sort of having somebody come in from admin or some recruiter who's sort of trying to sort of put in the, sort of here's the benefits of the job in the process. Any questions there? Overall, yes, we'll send out the recording here as we sort of have all these pieces. The next thing that we just want to talk about, again, from the Gen Z lens is when you think about, right, what it means to start to create that messaging. So whether you're doing this on social media, whether you're doing, right, sort of wherever you're putting your messaging out, right, what we know is that Gen Z wants to have somebody that they can learn from and view as an effective leader, right? And there's obviously a bunch of research around principal pipelines and the key role that principals play in terms of actually, right, sort of holding on and creating culture in schools that keeps teachers around and wants them to sort of keep working. Not surprisingly, right, it's also the sense of, right, people want to feel like there's a career path. They want to understand is, right, the world of teaching for 30 years is gone. It's just, that's dead, right? And it's a generational shift. And so the idea that all of a sudden teaching has to be a stepping stone into whether it be coaching, whether it be, right, other administrative roles, whether it be leadership, right? Teaching has to be able to sort of create some future upward trajectory. And so we have to start to reposition the role of teaching, not as this, right, there's 30-year teachers waiting for their pension. Because frankly, right, Gen Z doesn't really care about the pension. They're just not. We'll talk a little bit in the end about what that means. But really, at the end of the day, we sort of know this is a really sort of clear option to be able to start to think about career paths in the process. And then ultimately, right, we know Gen Z is really, really, really mission oriented, right? More so than any generation before it. And the idea that we can start to actually leverage our impact and really understand, right, we should be dominating the ability to actually, right, engage from an actual, right, impact perspective. And unfortunately, right, I think a lot of the COVID, a lot of the sort of the craziness, a lot of the bureaucracy gets in the way of that messaging. And so historically, right, and I think, these are not really big, crazy, new ideas. And so at the end of the day, right, certainly every generation would have said, yeah, I want a good boss. I want a future. I want a bigger vision. The reality is, right, in the prior generations, right, these were, nice to haves. And people would say, all right, I'm going to go, get a, I'm going to try and I'd like to have a good boss and I'd like to have a growth trajectory. But like, those are things that you still took the job because of this job. Fundamentally today, the biggest shift is because unemployment is so low and because of the way things have changed, right? We know that these are now just baseline conditions of employment. And if you can't speak to each of these in every single conversation you're having about a job, or if you can't create messaging for these in every interaction you have with candidates, you're losing an opportunity there because these are now not just, right, sort of the actual, right, nice to haves. They're just baseline levels of if you don't have it, I'm not going to continue work. And we hear, and I know everybody on this call probably has stories of people getting into a situation and candidates either leaving day one because they were like, this doesn't sort of check with me. And so it's really about trying to share stories that hook into each of these themes and make it clear that this is really sort of the goal is to how do we make that really work. Any questions there just on sort of those pieces? And I think you now are off mute. Maybe. Or I can just, or Lucia, if you can just put everybody in allow to talk, it'll keep them on mute in the process. That might be the easiest way to do it. Since it looks like we have to allow everybody to talk, which is going to be annoying. Any other questions here? Okay. And so that's really the sort of, again, baseline sort of table stakes in terms of, right, thinking about trying to sort of grow your own talent and really think about what does it mean to sort of build the community from within, which frankly is going to have to be a place that districts spend a lot of time, right? I think this is actually probably the future of recruitment, and the future of talent pipelines are going to be community centric and district centric because unfortunately, right, we've now, right, told generations of kids that teaching isn't a great profession. And so the ed prep enrollment and the actual sort of, there just aren't enough 20-year-olds to staff the profession anymore. And so a lot of recruitment for new talent is really sort of, swapping deck chairs in the same boat, right? It doesn't really work. But we are seeing, right, districts that are really making the messaging around how do I recruit? How do I sort of advance? How do I sort of hit those same messages in terms of creating career opportunity and connecting you to mission? Those are really important. As it relates to sort of the, again, sort of top sort of things that we've seen districts do in terms of recruiting new talent, right? Apprenticeship programs have been one, right? The idea that you can get a free bachelor's degree or a free master's degree is really compelling. And that those sorts of on-the-job programs that respect an educator's time and don't force them to go nights and weekends to get a degree, right? Don't force them to spend time away from their family, right? It's really sort of helpful to be able to sort of understand, right, that you can now actually earn a degree, a master's degree, right, a bachelor's degree entirely during the workday. And that will fundamentally change, right, how we actually think about recruiting teachers, because the districts that are really investing in their staff, it's the same as Starbucks, right? Starbucks spends a lot of money on actual degree programs for its candidates. And you can talk to baristas all the time who say, yep, I'm working at Starbucks, but I'm doing it because I'm getting a degree out of it for free. And that's a huge recruitment sort of paradigm that's now made a massive shift. Teacher residencies, sort of similar in this vein. Again, I think part of the reason that teachers feel, right, that we've seen a lot of, sort of mix, especially in the recruiting bachelor's degree candidates from out of field, is people just don't get a lot of the support that they feel like they need. And so where we've seen data really sort of show that teachers can get the support they need is in these sort of residency and teacher academy programs, where all of a sudden you start as a teacher and you've got, right, in some capacity, right, you've got somebody coaching you on a day in and day out basis. And so as you think about sort of the systems that you have for coaching teachers, what's the narrative? What's the stories of your coaching processes that you're sharing in your recruitment? Because people want to know and want to feel like they're going to be successful and they're going to be able to demonstrate mastery on a relatively quick basis. And that as hard as, this current generations of kids can be post-COVID, right? That's the stories that people are hearing. And so the more we can combat that and actually create stories of the residency programs, of the coaching programs, the academies we have, and how those are really helping get folks up the curve with what really good classroom management looks like, those are things that will ultimately help really win the day when it comes to recruiting new talent, when it comes to recruiting career switchers in the process. Certainly, again, we've seen lots of sort of intern certifications, provisional licensure pathways. This sort of relates to the first two, which is the more you can find candidates from out of field, that's great, right? That's really helpful. But what we know is it's about how do you then sort of support those interns, support those provisional license pathways with really strong coaching. Right now, the data on retaining, an out of field sort of provisionally licensed educator is 3 years-ish on average. And so it's not great in terms of the process. Obviously, it's a little bit of a Band-Aid, but I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't be able to sort of extend that at least a couple more years. And there's actually some slides here in a minute that we can talk to for it, because we know that that's really helpful in the process. Obviously, Teach for America is another one that's pretty interesting in the overall sort of process. Again, similar sort of lines. And then we've also seen districts do a lot to start to recruit and build a pipeline of future teachers from their substitutes. And this idea that, right, substitutes are already, right, in a little bit of a transitional space. And so the more you're having conversations and targeting your subs as future employees, that's a really strong potential candidate pool that can help in the process. Next one is obviously we've seen a bunch of districts have success with sort of these cultural exchange programs where you're bringing in teachers from, right, the Philippines, bringing in teachers from, right, so the Caribbean, whatever the case may be, and then helping the community build that into the fabric of the school. It's a pretty heavy lift, right? And we know, I've heard all sorts of stories of districts really helping find housing and helping sort of organize and manage the process. And it's a big lift on the candidate because they have to, right, be away from their families and they're sort of doing it to earn money and earn a future living. But it does help as a stopgap in the near term. And there's definitely sort of programs out there that can help marshal that sort of process for you. And then again, right, where you're actually sort of spotlighting events and using social media as a way to create those sort of events. The days of, right, in-person recruiting fairs are just gone. And they're frankly just not, right, either most of the candidates there will already have a job, or, right, the candidates who are looking for a job aren't going to go there because that's not the digital native medium that they want to be in. And so the more that we can sort of create more virtual spotlights, right, sort of we've seen a whole bunch of interest from the press just trying to actually say, well, what does it look like to actually sort of show and showcase the work that districts are doing? And so there's lots of opportunities to make that work. And again, on the same line, how are you integrating this into social media? Whether it's TikTok, whether it's right Instagram, whatever the case may be, trying to sort of understand that that's where the eyeballs that you want to hire are, and that it's really trying to sort of create those stories and figure that out. The next one, the last two are a little bit more sort of policy oriented here, which is really, right, how are we thinking about actually removing alt cert, right, sort of our traditional cert barriers? And in a bunch of states that we've been working with, it's really kind of crazy to think about the barriers that just a traditional cert candidate has to go into, right, is really crazy relative to what now the alt cert programs are. And so it doesn't make a ton of sense that we're now starting to create higher barriers for entry from candidates who are already in schools of education than candidates who are career switchers. And so there's policy issues that go along with that are really sort of entrenched in just the way the world used to work. But certainly the idea that we can start to have some systems in place to help navigate that. Reciprocity is the other, right? The more we have the ability to sort of create reciprocity and lighten the reciprocity sort of hoops that candidates have to jump through, the more we're going to be able to sort of attract candidates to the field and not have them get really just frustrated by the fact that it takes forever if you want to get a license in certain states, even if you already had a license out of state. And so there's lots that can be done there in the process. Any others on the recruitment side of things that have been worked? Thank you for those who are putting in some in the text here, in the chat here. Well, and then I think from a recruitment side, a lot of what we've sort of learned is really around sort of what the corporate world's been looking at. So whether we've had some experts that are just corporate recruitment experts working through it, a lot of, I think, the concepts and the designs that the corporate world's now using is really about what messaging are you putting out there? And really, it all goes back to this sort of fundamental question, which is, are the people, if you think about an individual candidate that might be out in the world, right? Is that candidate unwilling or unable to come work for you? And that's a pretty interesting shift when you think about sort of what it means in terms of, especially, right, our paras who are, unable to often get a license, right? Or a high school student who's trying to figure out what they want to do. And sort of, are they unwilling? Are they unable? And so framing the conversation around what are you solving for and what sort of messaging are you solving for in terms of being able to sort of attract candidates is a really important sort of shift that, again, we're not just sort of putting out, right? You have to assume every candidate that you're recruiting right now has many other offers to go other places that frankly have a less time commitment and a more flexible environment. And so the question becomes, how do you make it really sort of clear that teaching can be really helpful? And one of the other things I has found is really sort of interesting from a candidate level and from a corporate level is when you think about where someone's starting from, right? Basically, right, someone willing to switch jobs is a pretty heavy activation bar. And that in order to do that, right, the likelihood is that they're probably unhappy with their current position. And so the question then becomes, how do you then create messaging in your recruitment that highlights what the priorities are? And so compensation, we know, right? But compensation, we'll talk about it in a little bit, has not been proven to be sort of the be all end all, right? There's sort of baseline level compensation that we know candidates want. But work-life balance matters a ton. And turns out summers off is a pretty interesting, compelling option, right? Flexible working arrangements, schools probably aren't going to win here, right? And it's just worth acknowledging that that's something that's going to be given up because you just don't have the flexibility of remote work in the process. But there are ways to create advancement, there are ways to create skill development, and there are ways to really lean in on the impact of the work. And that we know goes really far in terms of the overall, right, sort of process of recruiting candidates in the work. And so those are sort of some of the best sort of learnings we've seen from the corporate side. And then really when it comes to sort of retaining folks, from a similar lens here, right? At the end of the day, the goal is what are you trying to do to really manage and support, right, the individual candidates? So we've seen all sorts of districts be successful with actually think about differentiating instruction. So if you're hiring folks without a field, if you just have one induction program, it's very likely that induction program, right, isn't going to cater to the wide range of new candidates you have coming into the school. And so thinking about how you clump together your career switchers, how you clump together your sort of new, right, some of these pair to bachelor's programs, thinking about how you sort of differentiate induction is a really interesting driver that can actually sort of drive some pretty amazing retention through it. We've seen lots of folks start to actually do sort of use the healthcare system around triage and say, well, where do we know teachers are feeling the pain? And whether it's using 15-5 sort of survey tools, right? There's a whole bunch of survey tools that we've seen folks use. And the whole idea is, right, what are those survey tools and how can you start to get data on when someone's thinking about or when someone's feeling the burn? And the more you can do that, then the more you can start to escalate and triage those folks with additional sports, additional coaching. But if you don't have data on how your teachers are feeling and doing, right, you're just not going to know. And the idea that you can sort of actually help triage based on some of these survey tools that corporate America is using is really valuable in terms of getting ahead of the pipeline and getting ahead of people actually leaving, right? Again, in the vein of that sort of advancement world, right, teacher leadership is really important. And the moment you can start talking with teachers, especially newer teachers, about here are your leadership opportunities, here's your ability to advance, here's where you can grow, that's a really important way to sort of keep folks in the profession and think about what that looks like. And then obviously folks really want more quick wins, more on demand, right, professional learning, right? The PD world is pretty watered down at this point, and so we know that that's been hard, but really being able to have quick wins and have ways for your teachers to access other expertise in the district on a 24/7 basis is really helpful and definitely keeps people more motivated in the process. And then again, if we think about sort of what those PD opportunities are, how do you actually articulate them to something that can get someone paid more money? And so the idea that you can start to create opportunities for learning that then ultimately go towards grad credit, towards master's degrees, towards advanced pay, that's a pretty big win because we know teachers can feel, right, you can make the profession a pretty rewarding one if we can get some of the bureaucracy out of the way and if we can get people up the salary schedules, right, in a sort of deliberate, meaningful way in the process. Mentoring is another big one that we know has come up quite a bit, right? The more you can connect folks to a mentor that they respect, the more they have a sort of a friend at work, that's a really important relationship. And so using mentoring either in group sort of functions or using it at the sort of individual support level has been really, really important. And then again, we sort of touched a little bit on advanced degrees and opportunities and compensation for it in the process. And then again, last, I would put in here like competitive salaries. We know, and teachers, the data does not suggest that you need to make, right? You need to sort of see your way to 100 grand to be able to sort of teach in most schools, right? And that teachers are actually pretty happy if you can get up the salary curve and you can start making 50, 60, 75 grand, and you can see your way. Once you're at 75 grand, the data suggests that happiness basically normalizes. And you can sort of feed your family and you can have a really great life. And then it comes into all of the ways that you're doing these other things in terms of growth in the process. And the idea that you can start to sort of create that system and actually embed some of these sort of retention bonuses is really important in the process. And then one of the last ones that we know has been really important is, for a long time, right, districts have really been sort of doing exit interviews and, right, trying to understand why did someone leave? If you can reverse engineer that and actually do a stay interview, then you can start to actually talk to people about what's working, what's not, and how do you get in front of the actual, right, sort of issues that might pop up in the future going down the road. It's also, frankly, a way for you to learn what are the opportunities for growth that people want. And if you're asking teachers how they want to grow and you're trying to then work with them to understand what opportunities they have to move into coaching and mentoring and other sort of capacities, that's a really interesting way to sort of continue to sort of expand the footprint. And then we've heard a lot of folks in a similar vein as the stay interviews sort of doing listening and learning sessions, right? The more you can talk to teachers and make them feel heard, the better you can in terms of the process for it. Other questions? Again, I know this is a whole bunch, but we're trying to sort of cram this into a pretty tight timeline here. And so just want to make sure you have as many opportunities to sort of see what different things are. And obviously, as a small district, trying to do all of these is probably untenable. But there's certainly a lot of tools and systems out there to help you sort of continue to add as many of these into the toolkit of how you can sort of help keep folks. At the end of the day, right, and when you think about retaining teachers, right, so the big implications on retention is that at the end of the day, it's just about how do folks feel motivated to continue to grow and develop. And what we know is, right, especially even over the millennials, right, certainly over Gen X, right, Gen Z really wants to know, how am I going to advance? And what does it look like to be able to do that? And, right, how am I going to develop new skills? The really nice thing about teaching, and one of the things that's actually been probably a bigger shift societally is, right, corporate America has realized that teachers are really well trained and really good at sort of dealing with complex systems and problem solving. And so the idea that all of a sudden we can start to, especially for new, high school grads and start to trade, hey, we'll trade your college debt and we'll start to trade your ability to sort of get a ton of skill development that's really useful in the rest of the world, in corporate America. But we need you to teach for 3, 4, 5 years in the process, and we'll trade you the bachelor's degree for it. That's a really compelling opportunity and a way to flip how we think about the staffing structures, because we can't plan for 30-year teachers anymore, but we could build a pretty amazing talent system, especially with some of the coaching tools we have nowadays that could actually have 5-year teachers really sort of managing that. And that what we know is when employees feel like they have places they can go and grow, they're going to stay longer. And so this is a lot of the corporate data, right? But the idea that you can start to move, even if it's just moving schools, just moving, right, grade levels, grade bands, right? The more you can keep the program dynamic, the better, right? The longer someone's going to stay in the process. And that's a really important way to start to think about, again, from the survey data, from the exit data, right? From the stay interviews, what are folks doing in terms of their own mobility and how are you accommodating that in the process? And then ultimately what we know, and we've seen this play out time and time again, is that at the end of the day, time is just more valuable than money. And we've offered teachers $5,000 to complete, to complete courses, to complete micro-credentials in the past. And at the same time, we've offered teachers, right, in districts, the ability to get out of the PD days and not have to come to work on the PD days. Guess what teachers choose if you offer them $5,000 or the ability not to come in on PD days? They choose the ability not to come in on PD days. Time matters that much. And so it's really trying to think about how do we sort of frame the flexibility and the summers and, right, the ability to sort of have more control over your time, even though we know, right, the time during the day is much more rigid, but how do we sort of convey that? Because at the end of the day, right, teacher motivation is very, very clear. And this is probably my favorite book of all time from a motivational standpoint. If you haven't read it, it's absolutely the best thing you could take away from this conversation is, at the end of the day, right, what matters most to people is really 3 things. Autonomy, and so the question is, how are we giving teachers autonomy in their jobs and not making it a rote, right, sort of regurgitated career? Mastery, and so how are we helping teachers feel like day to day, week to week, they're getting better? And what's the coaching systems we have for that to make that work? And then purpose. And this, again, is where we should be knocking it out of the park. And unfortunately, we're not as a field today. What does it look like to really sort of connect on a regular basis with your purpose? And how does that look and what does that look like in the process? Because we know if we could do these 3 things and we could really make teachers feel this, we can start to reverse the trend that we're seeing and we can actually solve the shortage, because it's not, right, this isn't an entrenched sort of thing that's just unsolvable, right? We actually have enough interest in people wanting to be in the profession. And we know, right, that there are ways to navigate the bureaucracy to get them in. It's just trying to navigate, right, bureaucracy. And so it's really about trying to sort of ease the barriers and sort of not have candidates have to go it alone. And then ultimately, right, it then becomes, what's feedback and coaching look like as you navigate that bureaucracy? And then finally, right, what are the ways to fund that? And so certainly the apprenticeship funding sort of sources, obviously the fact that we can start to use some federal aid and a bunch of these new Department of Labor sort of fund, workforce funding, those are really interesting ways to redesign the teacher pipeline and start to build it from within the community. And so that's something we've just seen a lot of really sort of crazy help in the recent last couple of years here. So again, I know this has been quick and we covered a ton of ground, but certainly happy to open it up to questions and sort of talk through if there's other questions other folks need. Again, we'll share out the recording and we're happy to sort of share if there's other things that would be helpful. But let me just open up to questions. Anything else that folks want to be able to talk through or anything else that we can be helpful with given the conversations? All right. Well, thank you so much for all the time. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate all the sort of engagement. And again, if you have questions, happy to follow up. Right, you see my email here on the page. But otherwise, thank you so much, and we look forward to chatting here in the future. Take care, everybody. Stay warm.